Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Art's virtual panel discussion, Front Burner. My name is Maria Lopez, and I am the manager of film and lecture programs at the museum. Before we begin with the lecture, I'd like to give everyone an overview of the agenda for today. This virtual event will last about 1 hour and a half. We will begin with short presentations. We'll begin with short presentations from the artists. Then we will have a discussion led by our moderator, Lien Truong. And we will then have a short 10-minute Q&A session with our panelists. Please enter any questions using the Q&A function or the chat box on Zoom. And you can also, if you're tuning into YouTube, you can also ask the questions in the comments. When asking questions, please specify if the question is for all or one of the panelists. We will try our best to get through as many questions as we can. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator for tonight, Lien Truong. Lien Truong's art practice examines belief systems, notions of heritage, and material ideologies in painting. Lien Truong is also an associate professor of art in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Welcome, Lien.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Well, Maria, I would just want to say thank you so much for having us all here. And I really want to thank NCMA and Ashton Browning for the show. So Ashton, as many of you know, is also a painter who's extremely committed to her practice and is working out of North Carolina. And she worked tirelessly, I think, in collaboration with NCMA to create the show in the making for a few years. And right now it is finally, they've opened up back up, and I hope you go and check it out. We were able to see the show before the shutdown due to COVID. And one of the things that I was just so humbled and taken by was how the show itself really exhibited the diverse painting practice that's happening in North Carolina. And this is, true of the content, methodology, and form, and also the backgrounds of many of the artists. And so I would encourage everyone to go check it out. And so I just want to talk a little bit about tonight. And so given the fact that the museum has been shut down for a while, and recognizing that it would be hard for some people to go and see the show, so we've decided to ask the artists to speak and give a little short presentation about their work in the show and to give some context around that. And then after that, we are going to go and launch into the discussion. And so I am an artist, I teach, I've never moderated a discussion before. And so the way I'm seeing it is these are all painters that I've been exposed to their work, and their work is so layered and interesting. And so I'm really, wanting to consider it as like if I was sitting down having a drink with them, what I would want to ask them, and then the kind of conversations that we would have. So some of the questions are for all the panelists, but for each one, I've also constructed a more intricate question that I would like them to respond to. And so let me see here. Okay. And so then, so what I'm going to do right now is just introduce all three panelists. I'm going to give a little brief introduction about them and their bio, and then we'll start off with Antoine's presentation first. Okay, so so let me go and start with the bios. So Antoine Williams. So Antoine received his BFA from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and his MFA from UNC Chapel Hill. His mixed media work investigates themes of power, the body, and the monstrous, creating his own mythology of social monsters about the complexities of contemporary Black life. He has participated in a number of socially engaged community-based art practices, such as pop-up art shows, after-school art programs, and underground rap concerts and film festivals. And his exhibitions include the Mint Museum of Art, Michigan State University, Columbia Museum of Art, Smack Mellon, Brooklyn, in Brooklyn, 21C Museum, as well as many other venues. He is also a recipient of the 2017 Joan Mitchell Award of Painters and Sculptors. Williams is an assistant professor of art at Guilford College. Our next panelist is Carmen Neely. And Carmen earned her MFA in studio art from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and the BFA in painting from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. In her painting practice, she subverts traditionally masculine painting gestures in the canon and turned painting into an act of femininity. With each brushstroke, she pushes back against the status quo, inserting herself into a larger dialogue about signification and contemporary abstract painting as a Black woman artist. Her exhibitions include Art Air Gallery in Brooklyn, Jane Lombard Gallery, Lump Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art in Charlotte, Prism Art Fair, Entitled Art Fair, Satara Gallery in Dusseldorf. Neely has been a resident artist at Sparkbox Studio in Ontario, Canada, Vermont Studio Center, and at the McColl Center for Art and Innovation. And our last panelist is Luke Miller Buchanan. And Luke attended North Carolina State California, University College of Design, where he attained his Bachelor of Environmental Design and Architecture with a minor in art and design. Buchanan has translated his connection with built environments into visual metaphors for the experience of memory, often using collage to provide both a physical connection to the past and references to the transitory nature of life. His work has been shown in exhibitions, which include the Green Hill Center, Lee Hansley Gallery, the RDU Airport, Visual Arts Exchange, Telfair Art Fair, and Art Space, and the National Center for the Humanities in Morrisville, North Carolina. In addition, he has numerous murals in site-specific locations in Raleigh, North Carolina. Great, so thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here with you all and to have this dialogue. So now I would like to invite Antoine to share his screen and start his presentation.
Sure, thank you, Lien. Let me share. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everybody, for showing up tonight. So since I don't have a ton of time, I just want to do a quick overview of my general art practice. So I'm an interdisciplinary artist. I work in a variety of media. A lot of the themes that you will find in my work is power, perception, the body. I deal with questions of humanity. Who gets to be considered fully human. Also in my work, I think of myself as creating a catalog of social monsters. I also deal with critical race theory, but also what's called monster theory. And so it's this ideal that society creates its own monsters, and that monsters a society creates says more about the society than it does about the actual monsters. And so with this, like, monsters are the border between status quo and the other. And oftentimes we don't fear monsters, we fear what they represent. And so oftentimes marginalized people are a stand-in for monsters. So that fear of the monster can be exploited by those within the status quo who have power. And so one of the tenets of monster theory is that the monster always returns. So, no matter how many times you destroy the monster, it's going to come back. And so if the monster was to actually be destroyed, then that border between status quo and the other would dissipate, that fear would dissipate, and then that power would dissipate. And so that brings us to this piece here, A Moment of Rest While Convincing Monsters That I Am Human. I did this piece in the summer during the uprisings around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. At the time, I was also reading a lot of Afro-pessimism. So I make wheat paste installations, but they normally start out like this as ink on vellum drawings. So here you have this 24 by 24 inch drawing, which usually ends up as installations like this here. That is 15 feet by 15 feet, which is currently on view at SICA. And so here we have Study of a Hotep holding on to the myth of power. In this piece, I'm looking at intersectionality and the fluidity of the monstrous. But again, we have these ink on vellum drawings, and here this 12 to 13 foot installation, wheat paste installation. So I work with installations, wheat paste quite a bit, but sometimes I merge them with found objects, like in this piece here for Freddie, which you have the body that is the plastic sheeting and pieces of shards of wood and these seatbelt straps that come together to create this figure. Here we have Because They Believe in Unicorns. It's a piece, it's an installation that I made after reading The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. The title of the book is The New Jim Crow, and it talks about mass incarceration and colorblindness. So what I decided to make here is a colorblind unicorn, and it's comprised of found objects and becomes this assemblage piece. But it's hanging in this room that is made up of collage and paint. And so I've been doing collage for actually quite some time. And here's one of my more recent pieces. It's part of a series titled There Would Be No Miracles Here. I made this series, I did it during the summer as an Instagram fundraiser where I partnered with some different art institutions in North Carolina to raise money for Black Lives Matter. The way I make these pieces is that I do an underpainting, I collage on top, and then I sand, and I do these alternate layers of collaging and painting, and then I sand down the surface. So that brings us to here. Portrait of Super Predator. It's a series of paintings I started in 2018. And so with this, I'm really interested in process and materiality. And so if we go back to these collages for a second, like I really wanted to, with these collages, to isolate these distressed areas within them. And so, because for me, these distressed areas represent memory, they represent trauma, class strata. And so what I'm trying to do is explore painting with collage, but also at the time I was looking at a lot of Jack Whitten's work. And so I was also thinking about collaging with paint. So here's the piece that's in the show. If you look at the different the different values of orange, that's me actually collaging with the paint. So conceptually, these are portraits of conditional humanity. These are portraits of Black people who've been labeled as super predators, which is a term coined in the 1990s. Essentially, it equates Blackness with criminality. So for me, the titles with these pieces are really important. The titles represent, they reflect the precarious nature of Black humanity. And the titles hopefully are like a push and pull between humanizing and dehumanizing. So each title has Portrait of a Super Predator as the first part. And so that's meant to be this label. So Portrait of a Super Predator labels the Black body as monstrous within society. However, the second part of each title, which is different, is meant to be somewhat humanizing, and it shows the reality that the Black body exists within a world in which the society itself is what's monstrous. So again, this is the piece that's in the show, in the exhibition. But here are a few other ones. Portrait of a Super Predator who left home, then came back smelling like outside. And then we have Portrait of a Super Predator who no one believes, so they say she was talking out the side of her neck. Okay, so that's all I have right now. Thank you, I really appreciate it. And I think I'm going to stop share. Hand it back over to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Antoine. That's really wonderful. And I think next I would like to ask Carmen to share her screen and share her presentation.
Hi, thank you, Lien, for the introduction. And I also want to start by saying I'm very happy to be here and talk with all of you and to be participating in this exhibition. So I'm going to just give a little bit of background about my work. And to do that, I want to start in 2016 with this piece called Keep It 100. So I think for me, and out of a combination of a lot of influences, being from the American South, where family heirlooms are a traditional part of a lot of family cultures, being raised as an only child, where I had a lot of companions found in inanimate objects, and coming from, a lineage of family members and women and people who hold certain objects as being sacred. have collected a lot of things in my life and feel like sort of savoring or valuing the referential ability of an object to people, to experiences, to places is really important. And that found its way or manifested in my practice in a different ways around the time of this work. So similarly to Antoine, around this time, titles of works became really important to me because I realized they were ways to specifically continue to document things from my life. And from this point on, up until the present day, the titles generally come from very specific conversations that I have with people in my life. So they are phrases that have been spoken by myself or another person to me, or in a shared conversation that I was a part of. So this piece, Keep It 100, is significant because I was already interested in gesture, but exploring the ways in which objects can be inserted into that language and starting to think about the gestures themselves in the paintings as individual objects. So each one as its own sort of unique player in this larger narrative, and holding the capability to like develop its own history over time, and each thing having that potential. And so in this piece, there are a lot of movements or gestures in the material of paint, but a lot of other additional objects like the pillowcase that the entire painting is resting on top of, and polymer clay forms that I sculpted, and plastic pieces of felt that are all embedded in the work and sort of creating this narrative through a shared language that they find together. And this is another example when sea creatures ask about you. From a bizarre conversation I had with a friend about her experience of close encounters with fish, scuba diving. And so, but I'm playing, so it's like very specifically referential to me, but what happened when after I sort of like thought about recreating gestures in other material formats, sewing them into the work, embedding them into the work, it went into the direction of me exploring plexiglass. So there are laser cut forms that I consider to be gestures in this painting. There's mirrored plexi, there is clay, there is foam. Things are screwed in and wrapped together. And I am still interested in, even though the work in the show is on canvas, and so the manipulations of material are very different, I'm very much interested in the way in which I can tie in all of these sort of personal relics and things that have their own unique sort of histories and stories to share as just material objects into this language. This piece, Maybe We're Just Drawing Out Bad Diagrams, is actually from, I don't know if Antoine will remember, a conversation I had with him and another artist, Cheryl Rowland, a few years ago in 2019. And we were talking about the idea of traditional relationship structures and thinking about the kind of examples or plans that we see laid out for us by families, by our parents, by people that we grew up with, and that ultimately no one ever really knows the answer or like the formula to successful like intimacy or romantic relationships. It's all kind of jumbled up and unclear, and we're all trying to do this dance and like work it out together as this really complicated equation. And so the idea of that sort of plays out in these lines that appear to be attempting to create some structure, but it is very much, you know, unclearly like directly legible. There's also embroidery, and as close-ups, this is kind of also where I started using enamel pins as a reference to another type of gesture that has a direct link to like the way we think about objects in the world and the way in which other people can understand the idea of collecting forms as a link to identity or expression of identity, and sort of using that enamel pin, the history and cultural meaning that that object has as a tie-in to the significance of gestures in this whole language of abstract expressionism. Other close-ups to show enamel pin forms of the same shape, sort of recreated again in a different material. So this pink form is also the pink form that's embroidered is also the pink form that is the pen. And I continue to recreate many of these gestures in different formats. So this is a drawing on paper, which has digitally collaged elements that are printed onto watercolor paper. This same form, which oftentimes once they're repeated, they get names that are very like personal to me. So this pink form is named Tina, and she's reoccurring in a lot of the works as different types of objects, but still referencing herself and referencing this whole unique history that she has in telling other parts of my personal history in previous paintings. I wanted to show sort of a shot of the entire series, which is just a small collections of paintings that the work from the show originated in. So at Untitled Art Fair in 2019, I did this series of works called Intellectualized Intimacy that was about sort of the way in which two people can overanalyze a relationship and kind of beat it to death with their intellectualization of just like raw emotions that they feel, and just going through those things instead of being so much in their head and reevaluating that at the end of it. This piece, everybody's a bad guy to somebody, but nobody's a bad guy to everybody all the time, again, is using like additional materials like the disco ball to signify a party or the end of a party. And then a lot of other gestures that are again borrowed or beginning to start new histories within the piece itself. And that leads up to sort of like a very abbreviated historical lineage to get to the piece that's in the NCMA show in an alternate reality, which is from that series about a breakup, and ultimately is kind of conceptualizing a happy ending that didn't occur for a relationship that ended and also had a lot to do with popsicles and flower crowns. All right, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Carmen. That was really wonderful. So I'm going to awkwardly here insert myself between Carmen and Luke for my presentation. It's because I speak about abstraction also in my work, and I end with a landscape, and so that will make sense with their works. All right, so let me share my screen. All right. All right, okay, so I want to give some subtext to the work that is at NCMA right now, and it is a piece that uses landscape and a gesture, abstraction, and also linen and silk. And so for me, this was a way to really explore narrative and specifically American transnational narratives. And so I just want to share with some context and with some influences that inform the work. So the first is a text that has really informed a lot of my practice, and it's a foundational text in post-colonial theory. It's from Edward Said. And he is speaking and writing about a concept called Orientalism. And in his work, it's a really wonderful and complex book, but there are three contexts within the text that really affect my practice. One is that within Orientalist concepts, definitions of the East have changed throughout history, meaning Africa, the Middle East, and or Asia, and how these cultural and political misrepresentations of people from these areas are created in the West. And the last, and this is very specific also to my coming to the South in 2014, how such things, such as paintings and monuments, exist as artifacts of cultural heritage, and how these misrepresentations perpetuate hegemony and fictionalize ideas of heritage that continue to permeate our belief systems today. And so this is an example of also things within the painting canon, kind of effects of these in the painting canon. And this is French Orientalism. And in Orientalist painting, these mostly came from France, British, and also Britain and America. They often represented people from the various East, as in Said's terms, in fictionalized ways, such as painting the harems and the odalisques that those painters would never have been privy to, being a foreigner. Often these representations of these bodies were also submissive or overly sexualized. And so in wanting to create American narratives, I really thought about the issues of figural representation historically, especially in Western painting. And so I turned to the worldwide textile trade, which is in itself its own narrative of hierarchy and power and migration. And so here we're seeing an example of how textiles were used as currency. And on the right, how hand-painted textiles from Asia were then, imported into the West and adorn the bodies of high society in America and Britain and France. And it also shows throughout the textile trade, with the worldwide textile trade, how these textiles also changed through political contact throughout history. So in this concept, I was really interested in a writing by Fernando Ortiz in the 1940s. And he created this concept of transculturation. And it put forth a new political context, a new theory that didn't only place itself in opposition to colonial dominion, and that this idea that in the intermingling of different peoples and cultures, new cultural phenomena are born, new things are created. And so in this work, I am abandoning figural representation, one, because of the issues of it historically, but also, really thinking about just, how can one speak about the process of assimilation and speak about the process of the creation of new identity. And it's really, for me, it was also really personal, being a refugee and immigrant coming to America and experiencing that myself. And so here I am, replacing figural representation with the gesture that's created through my hand. And within those gestures, I am adorning them with textile designs from a very specific region and time period to actually create these narratives, and they become a kind of patriotic uniform. I'm also not creating gesture really in sync with American abstract expressionism. I was really thinking about the Asian tenet of creating a painting that captures the essence of a subject, not simply to represent it. But a lot of my work does respond to the historic painting canon. And so, I was also really curious about, how these canons are made, and they're made, art histories and art canons are made, not devoid of political and social phenomenon, right? And so one of the things that I also found interesting was that in World War II, there were Asian abstractionists working in America, and how, why is it that we are mostly learning about them maybe within this past decade? And so one of the things, to think about is how Japanese Americans were interned during World War II, and how during the same time, a group of predominantly white male artists in New York were meeting at a place called the Club and discussing important concepts such as Zen. And last year, in a hyperallergic article, Daniel Wu was reviewing a show in Honolulu called Abstract Expressionism, Looking East from the Far West. And one of the things she speaks about is how art critic Clement Greenberg opposed the perceptible link between the Abex artists and Asian discourse, and how he wrote in 1955, not one of the original abstract expressionists, least of all Klein, has felt more than a cursory interest in Oriental art. The source of the art lie entirely in the West. Not only is the xenophobic statement untrue, it also served to erase American abstract expressionist artists such as George Miyazaki and Bernice Bing, who we see here. All right, so another thing that I was really, at this time in my practice, I was really missing a practice that painters go through, kind of like embodied thinking that they go through. That's mostly, I find, that is immersed in abstract painting. I was also considering the contextual embodiment of materials. And so I became really interested in thinking about the hierarchies and the processes and the materials of paintings that come out of European traditions and Asian traditions. So I was actually using, things like silk and linen, to really kind of refer to those traditions to kind of test out the hierarchies. And this brings me to the piece that is right now at NCMA, and it's called I Buffalo. And this piece was the last series of that piece, and it was really straddling, it was the first piece that I started using landscape in there too. And so in this piece, the textile designs are there are, I think, Sioux Indian, there are Southeast Asian, for instance. And within that, I'm also using Thomas Bridstat's Yosemite. There's a replication of it on the upper left over there. And so for me, you know, this was a very biographical piece. It was me coming to this country and really kind of mindful of coming from Vietnam, a place that has been colonized for centuries through China and France, and then basically, you know, becoming a citizen and in America, and really, you know, acknowledging that we are also on colonized land. And so I started using the landscape of Thomas Bridstat's because of his association and his part of the Hudson River Valley School, which was founded by Thomas Cole. And although Cole and others were immigrants and not imperialists, their works really became associated with Manifest Destiny. Okay, and so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, and that's my presentation. Okay, so now I would love to invite Luke to share his screen and give his presentation.
All right, let's give this a try. So I just want to say that, you know, I'm very happy and I'm honored to be included with so many wonderful artists in the show, and a big thank you to Ashlyn Browning for putting it together, and to the North Carolina Museum of Art for having me. And that's a part of this panel too, as well as Maria. This is a shot of my studio. I came across painting maybe in a different way. I went to school at the North Carolina State University School of Design, which then turned into the College of Design, and graduated in the School of Architecture in '02. Very much intending to be an architect, to build, to create spaces. While there, I met, well, not really met, but my fundamentals teacher, Lope Max Diaz, who was a wonderful painter. He was such a great teacher that I took a mixed media painting class, just kind of on a whim with him. And in that class, I started to kind of transfer the work I've been doing on the side into painting, finding that my photography could mix with painting in a new way. And I won't really tell much more about that, since the painting that I have in the show in Front Burner is kind of about what brought me to be a painter. And I'm going to show you some process photos on how that came to be. Just a quick overview. This is a very recent painting I did, maybe last March, probably the most recent painting I've actually completed. Completed is a relative term. I don't have a title for it. It's not signed, but I haven't worked on it in several months. So my colleagues can probably tell you that sometimes mean that it's done. This is a painting of Philadelphia. It's a painting about winning and losing, and about how, not to be macabre, but how none of it really matters, since we're all going to die one day. And how there's history in spaces that we don't even really take the time to reflect upon, which is one major theme of my work. This is an image of the painting before it was painted on, when it's just collage. Similar to Antoine, I have worked in collage many times, more so now than I used to. I find that in attaching these, at first my collage attempts were like colored paper, and as I grew up and started to give more intention, I realized that I had all of these things that I'd been keeping for my life, that I was keeping them for some reason and I didn't know what the reason was. And eventually I realized that it was to use in these paintings. Here's another one that's pre-painting, just collage. This is a parking deck in downtown Raleigh. Again, very much so just the collection of like detritus, similar to, you know, maybe the idea of sacred objects, of things that are passed down, but much more watered down than that. More like magazine inserts, matchbooks, old magazines, things that mean something a lot to you at a time, but eventually are discarded as a metaphor for our lives, maybe in our memories. This is the same painting after I kind of completed it. This is the painting that is in the show. This is just a modern rock song. It's the backside of some buildings here in Raleigh. I apologize for it being crooked and kind of not well lit. These are process photos, not finished photos. But after our discussion, leading up into this, I thought that this process run through might be interesting. So here's that same site. I actually took this photograph in 2012. I had to go way back in my phone to find it. 8 years ago, I was walking by and I saw this area and I decided that was something that was worthy of painting. It took me 8 years to finally come back to it, to do this painting. When Ashley asked me to produce a painting for this show, I immediately knew that this is what I wanted to do, because I had been putting it kind of on, no pun intended, the back burner for a long time, until I finally had things ready to actually make it. Here's just a few shots of some of the photographs that I took, maybe that didn't make it into the painting. This is a lot of what I do is similar to site research in architecture, maybe looking into what used to be there, what is there now. I find beauty in common space, maybe in simplicity. I don't think that the person that, as if anyone actually looks at these photos that they're printing now, but when they used to, I don't think anyone would have found any of these photographs particularly compelling. But what I do is I take this collection of photographs and I add them together. And in this case, I had to return to the site multiple times over about a week, always at the same time of the day, because I really wanted the shadows to line up, but there was cars parked in the parking lot and I had to kind of navigate around that. Ended up assembling, I don't even know, but it looks like around 150 prints here. And then I kind of measure that whole and then create a canvas to hold it. My painting teacher that I mentioned earlier, Lope Max Diaz, taught me that the painting is everything. It's the canvas, it's the stretcher, it's the hanging equipment, it's every piece of the painting is what makes up the whole. So I try to make every piece of every work that I do, minus the found objects, obviously, and try to take as much care and craft as I can in that construction. And now you see that with much less photography, I've edited out a lot of the photos, kind of just sticking with the ones that made the most sense and kind of carried the most weight. You can see I edited out the cars and the air conditioner units and things that, while equally valid, didn't really speak to my cause. And then I start to experiment with adding more collage material. And the collage material, as I mentioned earlier, is all things that I've collected over my life, be it old matchbooks and membership cards or flyers, magazines, photographs, things like that. This is an actual flyer from a show that my friend's heavy metal band had in high school at a place called the Caboose in Garner, which I don't think exists anymore. I don't know why I held on to this flyer for 20 years, but it ended up making its way into this painting. And I feel like there's a reason for that. I was definitely saving it. And in this slide, I was showing that the nature of the collage allows for negative space. I can't fill in every single part of the space, nor do I really want to. But I tried to intentionally include pieces of negative space in this painting to let the viewer know that I did this on purpose. And in the circles in particular, with the embroidered line across it, references pi, pi being an infinite number, the idea of infinity containing all numbers, and therefore, if you go into binary code, all things, and truly understanding what is infinity, and it's encapsulated in every circle that you've ever seen, I think is a powerful idea. I included 5 circles collaged out of the main collage, edited out of the main collage of this painting, both in reference to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parking spaces, but also in reference to the 5 planets that are visible from Earth. I have a strong connection to animals and astronomy and things that are working around the world while the rest of us are sleeping or meeting friends for drinks or going on Zoom calls and things. the idea that the world is working without us, I think makes me feel special to be a part of it. And I realized that, and here we are with all of the collage material, but no painting. I realized that I'm lucky to be here. I'm lucky to be in this show. I'm lucky to be on this earth. And I try to use my time and my experience and my trash to focus in on one experience, ideally as a metaphor for everyone's experience. The found objects that are in this painting are of equal value to the found spaces that I try to focus my paintings on. The idea behind the found spaces being that they were used by other people, experienced by other people. Some people might have strong memories attached to them that we will never know. Similarly to music, which is one of my, honestly, like music is my number one thing. I think that music is the greatest form of human communication. And this painting is named after a song by Belle and Sebastian called "This Is Just a Modern Rock Song," which builds in complexity throughout the song until the end, where the singer Stuart Murdoch finally says, you know, we have to stop this or it's going to go on forever, which is kind of how I felt about the experience of doing this painting. But I included a lot of my heroes, including Calvin Johnson, Lou Reed, other people, friends. My friend Lauren Adams, my brother are both located in the painting. But you have to kind of dig for it. You have to kind of look for it. Some of the cigarette packs and the postcards and things in the parking lot appear to be trash and are trash, but they're also real things that have real connections to people that were important once that maybe are no longer important. Kind of in keeping with the Shinto idea that all things have spirits and all things have purposes. Even these seemingly discarded areas and seemingly discarded objects were meaningful once. And I believe that being meaningful once, they're meaningful always, if we're willing to pay attention to them. And that is what I got for right now. Hopefully that worked out okay.
Great. Okay. Oh gosh, like thank you so much. And I just want to say it's such a treat to see your process. You know, I think that often people don't get to see sort of like how a work is made. And so I really appreciate you showing you kind of like almost like, you know, breaking it down for us step by step. I do have a question. Was that piece made on linen?
It's actually hemp.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I used to collage onto panels because it's way easier, like having a firm surface. But over the years, I've learned, as I've expanded my work, panels got to be too heavy. So I started to work on linen. And for this large piece, to be totally honest, I couldn't really afford that much linen. So I went with, which ended up imbuing the painting with some texture that I wasn't expecting, but unifying some of the collage pieces into a whole that was kind of, I'll just, you know, admit we're all painters here. Like sometimes happy accidents happen.
Yeah, of course. Of course, that's private. We have to allow time for that too.
Yeah.
And it is really interesting to see your that flyer that you know kept from high school. And I actually like that kind of how, in some ways, you know, you and Carmen, you're dealing with kind of similar things in that way, right? Kind of these notions of artifacts as heritage. But it kind of reminded me of Kenton Doll Hancock a little bit. Like if you, like he has Art 21 where you see a studio, but your studio is way more organized than his is. So,
I showed you a picture of the it's not usually like that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, okay, so I do want to kind of launch into our discussion now, and I just want to say thank you, all of you. I know for all of us, it's a challenge to give a 6 or 7 minute presentation, so I just want to like give us all hands. That's really difficult. So I did want to kind of start with just like a softball question for all of you, which I think is one that people are normally curious about, and so the question is like, how did painting first enter your life? Like, you know. And it could be through school, but also if there's any other way, like, you know, Kerry James Marshall speaks of how when he was 5, he got to see like a picture book, right? When he was good in school. And that really cemented his idea of how he wanted to be a painter. So yeah, so I wonder if you could maybe share that. Who would like to go first?
Um, I can if that's okay. Right, I haven't really thought about like that. That's interesting. I think my first engagement with art, kind of growing up where I'm from, was, as far as art, it was Good Times, and this is probably like a cliche answer, but like Good Times, on the show, there's one of the characters, JJ. He was a painter, and Ernie Barnes was the actual artist that made the work, and that to me was like, what? Wait, you can do that, right? To see that, and so like I had always been interested in art, but that was first time like seeing like a painter, because no one painted or made art where I was from, but like I always enjoyed doing it. And then going to college, and then I was an illustration major. I kind of got out of that because my stuff got more and more political, and then it got more and more, I guess, abstract. And then while I was in grad school at UNC Chapel Hill, I think it was Hong An who teaches there. It was like, or Roxana, I can't remember. It was like, you need to go to Nan Asher and look at this work by Mark Bradford. And I was like, that's okay. I get it now. And so Ernie Barnes, and I guess a lot later, looking at Mark Bradford's work, the scale, the texture, the
Antoine's
to the community and getting stuff. So like, yeah.
Antoine, I'm sorry, you froze just for a second. Can you repeat that last sentence for us?
Just
the
with
scale
Mark,
and the texture.
Yeah, the texture and the scale of Mark Bradford's work, the process of going into the community, having this material that means something, all of that. Just, it's not just what's on the wall; it's actually the entire process building up to it.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Antoine. It's wonderful. Who else? Luke or Carmen?
Carmen, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'm sorry, I had to run. I realized my computer was dying. So the tail end of your question, I just want to make sure I fully understand. It's like major art, specifically artistic influences, or
well, sort of like how painting first entered your life. And so, you know, Antoine spoke about a show, right, growing up. And so, yeah, just how that happened.
I started taking art classes as electives. I think like I had been in college as an undergrad for a few years, and I changed my major like many times and was like going through an early life crisis trying to figure it out. And this is a common story, but I thought that when I found art and when I realized, oh, people go to grad school for this. Oh, people like actually pursue this. There's like conceptual ideas. Like I had this idea of like what it even meant to do art. As something that was like very, I don't know, extracurricular. And I when I recognized there was a path, I realized I had to be on it. And I thought that I was going to be a photographer just because it happened to be that I was taking a lot of photo classes. But I would get in a lot of trouble because I wanted the tactile experience. Like I was in the darkroom all the time doing these like chemical experiments, which you shouldn't be doing. Like making these photographs that were very temporary because they weren't fixed properly. And so they were never going to last. And my instructor was this grad student who was constantly just like, what are you doing? So it's like, then it registered to me that like, okay, maybe this isn't my medium. Like there's something else. But also just taking those classes and recognizing that there was a very serious like scholarly approach to the process of making and thinking through making was huge for me. And I didn't get there because again, I didn't really have examples of that, you know, really clearly in my life before that time. Though I have to give a shout out to my mom, who I know is watching, because she, when I was a kid, I think the reason why I was even like willing and able to understand that I did process things through making is because whenever I had a class project, she would go all in with me, and we would go to Michael's or whatever craft store, and she would say, whatever your idea is, like, let's get whatever tools you need. And so those are like my early sculptures and like installations.
Well, that is so amazing. That's so wonderful. Thank you so much, Carmen. Okay, Luke?
So similar to Antoine, probably from the television first. When I was a kid, I stayed home from school, I think in 8th grade for a long time. I wasn't really sick, but without getting too much into it, I watched The Joy of Painting with Bob Ross every day on PBS, and I used to love it. And it might be cheesy, but I think that sometimes I still think back to that time and to his work to kind of center myself on the idea that like I'm doing this for myself. But also like Carmen, I didn't really get into painting. I was into photography. I loved photography. I loved the dark room. I loved all the complexity that came into going out and shooting and then coming back and then kind of editing and figuring out what was good and what wasn't, processing. And then when I was in college, again, in the architecture program, I took that special topics class and I brought into the class these photo collages that I had done, mimicking what I'd seen in skateboarding magazines, where they would take pictures of someone doing a trick down a railing, and it would be like quick exposures of a person. And you could see the background in the exposure. And I thought, what if I just take pictures of backgrounds? I started doing panoramic photography. No art history background, did not know who David Hockney was, found out later. And then I brought those to Lope Max, and he said, I said, I want to paint these photographs I've taken. And he said to me, like, why would you want to paint these photographs when you already have them? Like, why don't you paint something that you don't have? And something clicked inside of me, and I realized that I could use the photographs in collage and paint along with them. And that developed into the idea that the photographs were of a specific time and a specific place and a moment, but that the paintings could be added to and manipulated to maybe talk about a larger theme subject.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I find it so fascinating. And I just want to say, like, what I am enjoying is that how many kind of ties there are between our experiences. So like you, Luke, I really credit Bob Ross for my desires to become a painter. I was a latchkey kid, the youngest of 3 kids. I think I started watching Bob Ross at age 4 or 5, and he spoke to all of us, right, in that gentle voice, that we could do this too, which was amazing, and I think that for myself, we have that experience, but then I think when I was in junior high, I remember my mother getting really mad at me because I kept on rearranging the living room furniture because I just thought it was wrong. Like there was something like formally wrong about it. And, I just remember that moment, like, who does that, right? Rearranges their parents' furniture. But like, okay, that's so funny. But like Carmen, it's really my mom's fault. I think I became a painter because when I was 14, she came home one day and she's like, I signed up for an oil painting class. And as a 14-year-old, I was, first of all, really pissed. I was like, how dare you do this without asking me? And I went to one class and I was hooked. So yeah, I think it's just so interesting and wonderful. Well, okay, so I'm going to launch into the more personal questions now, and I would love to start with Luke. Luke, I have seen your work at NCMA. I think what's interesting is there's a lot of painters I've met in North Carolina, especially in the Triangle, but we haven't crossed paths, and I do blame it on our geographical locations. Raleigh and Chapel Hill are not that far apart, but yeah, I'm so sorry that we haven't met, but I'm so excited to see your work. And be able to engage with you in this manner. And I think reading some of your background, I also saw that you really admired Leonard Cohen. And I just thought, okay, well, he and I could definitely get along and have a drink together. And Daniel Day-Lewis, which who I also think is amazing, just amazing. But so I'm really interested, one of the things that really interests me is how photography and collage came so early in your practice, right? Because normally, I guess I feel like, especially if one starts with painting, like that kind of methodology might come later. But I was really curious about your background, the fact that you went to school for architecture and how you are just completely obsessed with space and how within that you are using, photography of space, your painting space. And in some ways your work is so deeply personal. You're embedding it with personal photographs, personal kind of, paper paper paraphernalia and things like that that are so personal to you. But then you also have within those spaces, they have their own histories, right? This histories of the genealogies of others. And what's interesting to me is how you also address that in your talk, you know, how you acknowledge that. So and then you also make murals, right? Which is a whole different kind of engaging with a space. And I imagine, you know, that when you're commissioned, you know, there's also kind of the sense of creative freedom that you have to negotiate with the entities that commissioned you. And so I'm really curious, like, if you could maybe talk about how these different forms, like, you know, either, you know, the spaces you're creating or your murals, and kind of how kind of acknowledging the personal and the private and then the public, how it affects your approach in creating these different ways in your of kind of making your practice, and how you adapt to these visual structures and their context and making them too.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They are similar but different. I think with the painting, coming into the painting, I will again thank and credit my painting teacher, Lope Max Diaz, like for not really telling me what to do, but for kind of presenting my options to me and allowing me to like make my own path. Photography was very important to me, and this was in like the late 90s. It was not digital photography. It was, you know, process, mostly black and white, but also doing like color process photography, and finding out that you could manipulate the images within, that when it came time to paint and I wanted to paint more, that was the visual language that I leaned on, the photographs that I'd already taken. However, I was not, Bob Ross notwithstanding, was not adept enough to actually paint the images that I wanted to paint. So I couldn't do it, which then combining the photography with the painting allowed me to create images and manipulate the spaces that I was interested in. Again, the spaces being places that spoke to me, not really that I picked necessarily, but that I found and got some sense of, this is a place that is important and I want to paint, or I want to interact with. And so when I was in my senior studio in architecture, you know, last semester before graduation, my teacher, I remember one of my classmates complained that our program didn't have enough constraints on it and that it was too open-ended. And I remember he said, this is the last time that you're going to get to have, to do your own design, maybe for the next 30 or 40 years. And that bounced around in my head for the rest of the semester. And I realized that I am kind of an independent person. Not that I can't be a team player, but I fixate on things that I have to like kind of delve into. And that through my painting, I was doing the same thing I was doing through my architectural site research, but just in a very much more personal way. And that the places themselves are not, they only speak to me because they are, you know, in my idea, dripping with like this spiritual residue that they were once very important. History, American history is also something that is like, you know, world history, but specifically American history is something that's also I'm very interested in. And so when I began painting murals, it was, honestly, it's a similar skill set, but it's much more of a design skill than what I do when I'm painting in the studio. But it's still manipulating a space and how people interact with it. And instead of painting a parking lot, I'm painting in a parking lot. Instead of like including like parts of myself and my history into the painting, I'm on display, I'm interacting with people that walk by. And honestly, I think that doing the mural work really exposed me to how difficult it was for a lot of people to access art, because when they see somebody on a ladder with a paintbrush doing a painting and then come back 3 days later and then 3 days later, and they can see, similar to the slideshow I showed, how it's made, they can understand the work that went into it and the energy and the spirit that's inside of there, and they respond to it because it's something that they were experiencing in real time as well. So I think that's how those two things are maybe similar.
Yeah. Oh God, great. Thank you so much. I think that there's also, I mean, it's interesting hearing you talk about sort of also the work on the canvas and then going to a mural, because I feel like there's maybe this general idea for people who don't paint, who think that painters can just do murals. You know, there's sometimes I mean, Antoine and Carmen are kind of nodding. I don't know. I get asked sometimes where I'm doing murals. I'm like, oh, I don't know about that. You know.
Take it till you make it. You know.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. So next, I want to pose a question to Carmen. Carmen, you and I met years ago at the Weatherspoon Art Museum, and I was so excited. You know, what I was introduced to you, and of course I went home and I knew you're an artist, and I looked you up, and I was like, oh my God, okay, I need to know this girl. And I think that there is just so I think that as painters, we don't meet, you know, many women and also women of color who work with kind of abstraction, right? Sometimes that's kind of like a more anemic, you know, population. And so I think that, you know, one of the things I want to say is when I have experienced your work in person, both in your studio and also, let's say at the NCMA show, one of the things that I recognize is sort of how I have a physiological response to it, and how I'm so acutely reminded of how intimate, you know, making a painting is. You know, how it's creating this intellectual and physical relationship of this thing we call paint, which is, you know, to this day, I still, when I think about it, it's like, you know, pigments. It's just basically pigments. And there's like this magic that we create from it. And looking at your painting is really such joy. You know, I think that there's such complexity in it. I'm reminded of the kind of the analytical slowness of looking at moments, but then how, you know, in order to take it all in, you know, I have to mentally kind of open myself up, right? And that's kind of a movement and almost a mental and bodily gesture, I think, in order to really kind of look at and experience non-representational painting. So I just want to say that, like, I think it's really, there's so much, I mean, people, you know, you hear people all the time say, you really can't experience a painting online, right? And then when you see paintings in person, you really recognize that. And I'm so acutely aware of that with your work, Carmen.
For that.
Yeah, and the work is, you know, I think it's also really complex in the making. You know, you mentioned the ABEX movement in your talk, and yet in speaking about your work, you know, you really convey really successfully just how deeply personal it is to you. And so the question I want to ask is that, you know, I think that I've gotten, you know, these associations, and I know you have too, is sort of like, you know, when a painter works with gesture, there's often an assumed connection with the American abstract expressionists, right? And that how, you know, given, you know, just how big they are in the canon, this makes sense, but there's also issues with this because it basically upholds white male creativity as the historical measure of greatness, you know? And so, you know, and as painters who go to, you know, school, we learn about them, we learn about the process. And so I also think that that connection could be real, right? And so my question to you is I guess I'm just curious, because I can't believe we actually never had this conversation before, and so we're just gonna have it publicly. So I guess I'm curious, what is your relationship with the ABEX painters? I'm interested in how much they influence your practice. I'm also interested in how you self-define your use of the mark and your use of paints and your handling of it. And finally, and of course I understand, you know, this is kind of a lot to ask, so just answer what you will and what you can. I'm also curious in any reflections you might have about the seeming ceiling that ABEX painters have in the context of painterly gesture.
Yes. Okay. No, these are amazing questions, and I'm eager to talk to you about them too. Especially because this like framing of being in the context of this particular history is something that is unavoidable for me, right? So I acknowledge it and claim it. And it's also something that has shaped me because this is the way in which currently abstraction is taught, right? In higher ed. And so there's a kinship I find with a lot of these male figures that are so dominant in conversations about abstract expressionism, because they were how I was also really introduced to this work and the genre. And obviously that has changed and evolved throughout time. And it's interesting because even though I was introduced to this work and painting, it did take me several years to get to the place where I was confident and comfortable enough to then really like boldly claim a place in the genre. And I think that's because I know it's because I didn't see myself reflected, right? So I felt so connected, particularly, I know I'm always talking about Antoine Williams, but I feel so connected to him. But then simultaneously very othered. And there was this really interesting experience I had of being outside of school and then reading more about him, and particularly him traveling through Northern Africa with Robert Rauschenberg and then borrowing these things from cultures that were very much outside of their experience, and then like pulling that and bringing it back to appropriate it into this other context and like use this idea of mark making and these things that are more like primitive and projected onto like Greek mythology. Like that's a really interesting, right? So I'm like reading about this and then like looking at these images and feeling so connected to the language of how he's like expressing and translating. But then the process is like very othering, right? I feel like pushed out by that narrative. And also like, yeah, just dealing with it. It's almost like a sense of like rejection in a way. Like you want to like claim these things, but then like do it in a way where you can't connect with like the actual history or of like their origin. And so, I mean, that's something that's like ongoing because I can't look at his works and not have this dual kind of experience. But I think that what is so powerful in what I'm growing to learn increasingly about other Black women and women of color who have been engaged in expressionism or gestural painting or abstraction, particularly in like American context, is that like that duality is also embedded in the work. And I recognize that it's embedded in my work. And I also come from this lineage of women who I just didn't know about until recently, right? We're dealing with this in the same way. Like they're having conversations or referencing or making work in reaction to this dominant, right, idea of what work at the time looks like in the 60s and 70s. And I particularly like Howardina Pindell, who was making this work that was very repetitive in terms of its process. That was a reaction to her like continuously being kind of placed in this box and being stuck and trying to work within this a system that was very, you know, limiting for her. But she was still like creating this very expressive work that had a lot of content embedded in it, even though like people weren't willing to read it as such at the time. And I could go on and I don't know, maybe you want to.
No. Well, no, I think, I mean, it's just so interesting hearing you talk because I feel like I feel like I'm so connected to you in this moment because I have very similar experiences, right? Like I just really recently last year learned about Bernice Bing, who is this abstract expressionist painter who came out of the Bay Area and whose work is really fairly unknown, you know, and so it's just really, you know, there's kind of that lack. And I also identify with you because I think that, you know, for me, you know, really, and American painters do this, right? We look at sort of like, you know, the traditions of American painting. So of course we're going to think about the abex, you know, but also kind of, I think that for me, the idea that they could own painterly gesture is just kind of ridiculous, right? You know, I think that one of the things that we see throughout the sort of careers of when we look at these comprehensive bodies of work from painters, you know, painters who have maybe been recently deceased or painters who have worked for decades, we see that, you know, this thing that we are working with, we form a very intimate relationship with it, you know, and so that often, you know, there have been painters who, you know, work with gesture throughout their life and it becomes more and more loose because they're sort of like, you know, they're more in dialogue with that. But I also, you know, I think it's a natural process of actually being a painter to be immersed in sort of like the movement of the material itself, but also thinking about like how it's this narrow lens that does come from America, but doesn't apply to all these other, kind of global movements of paint and painterly use. And so, yeah.
And I think I also want to say too, when I think about the way in which people tend to engage in artists of color, or it's particularly women of color too, dealing with who are making work in the genre. It's like, yes, there's this idea of these historical figures have ownership over this space, and everything then becomes referential to them instead of, and also there's like a also male privilege continuously of being able to be like the source of a creative reference, where then other people are tangents of that thing and just referential to your original thought. But that, like, if it would be wonderful if more people could engage with this work coming from these Black women abstractionists, as them being, I mean, something is happening where we're also kind of dabbling in something that is a little outside of ourselves, in the same way that they were dabbling from other cultures too. So even though I'm American and I like have been taught this history, I'm very familiar with it. Again, I'm still very much outside of it. And so it's something that is in my work, will always be a part of it, but I'm also tapping into this other kind of collective consciousness, collective experience, and things from my own personal, very specific history of being Black and American and being female, that like is a very much separate thing that deserves its own sort of like referential space, Yeah. So yeah. I think it would be nice for more people to just like think to come to the work with that in mind.
Yes, thank you so much. That was so important, ending on that. Thank you so much, Carmen. Great. Okay, so I see we're getting questions in, but I wanted to pose the last initial question to Antoine. So Antoine, you were one of the first people I met in North Carolina. So during my interview at UNC Chapel Hill, after my talk, you came up and spoke to me, and I remember it. I still remember it to this day. And, another reason why it's significant is because, then I moved here, and then I really got to follow your work and, see your work unfold and evolve and just into where your practice is now. And it's so rich, and it's also very powerful. And I think your work takes a lot of risks, in a very meaningful way. So I wanted to ask you about, about a body of work that you created called Study of Hotep Holding Onto the Myth of Power. And in this work, you're referring to critical race theory and monster theory, and you're talking about Hotepism, and how in this body of work, you are deconstructing how toxic Black masculinity, upholds anti-Blackness, in your own words, and how it's critiquing a brand of faux Black liberation, and also oppresses Black women and vilifies Black queer people, and is therefore anti-Black. And so in this moment of painting, one of the things that I think we're all aware of is that I think many painters of our generation, and I'm flattening us all in here, I know we're not completely the same, but is that there are a lot of painters of color who are making work feeling this anemic void that's been in Western art history of dignified representations of people of color, right? And so they're responding to this historical visual trauma by really, by acts of self-representation in very expansive, positive ways. And I think for you as an artist, making this work that I'm referring to is taking risk, and it's taking a lot of risk. Like it's diverging away from what we may consider to be a movement or direction of artists of color in the moment. But I just want to acknowledge that I think your pursuing of the work and its existence in the world is really meaningful and significant. And so I wanted to ask you about it, and maybe have you talk about the context of the work, the personal, intellectual, social, and artistic influences that inform the work. And also the visual and conceptual negotiations in making the work, because I think it was probably really tricky to do so.
Yeah, and I just want to say if my internet might go out, so forgive me if I have a weird while I'm talking. Yeah, so with that work, yeah, that was a long time coming. So before that, a lot of the work that I was making was, I was responding to a lot of the high profile police shootings that were happening, and it was a few years of making those wheat paste, that imagery. And so like, you know, an incident would happen and I would sort of respond to it. And that was like quite a few years. And then I got to a point where I began asking like, who am I talking to? Who, like, you know, who's my audience? And I just noticed that the conversation, there's this national dialogue around times. This dialogue was still, even though you're talking about Black people, you're still centering white people in it, where it's like, oh, we're explaining to like white America about race. And so like I felt like some of my work was probably doing that in a sense. And I got to a point where I'm like, I don't know what else I can say about race that Baldwin or Bell Hooks has said. Like I don't feel like I can add any more to that. But then I began wondering, it's like, well, instead of having these sort of interracial conversation, what if I had like an intraracial conversation? Like, and that's when I'm making the work, I'm more so thinking about, like Carmen and I talk a lot, like, and so like that conversation I'm having with Carmen is different than if I'm talking to a class about race, with people from not outside of the community. And so I'm more interested in those conversations, those intraracial conversations. And so, yeah, and so with that, if I'm talking about racism, but within the Black community, that becomes very different, because the history of it is Black cis men like me are usually the center of those conversations, right? And I felt as if I personally can't have this conversation without sort of acknowledging that, right? And so I wanted to make a work that implicated me, right? Or implicated, you know, people like me to having those conversations, especially in regard to like monster theory and this ideal of, you know, I start thinking that like the monster has to be, you know, it's this ideal of the monster is it's fluid, right? And so like it's really interesting in how looking at like Kimberly Crenshaw and this ideal of intersectionality, in that individuals are occupying the same space as someone who is oppressed and someone who is oppressing people. And so for me, a lot of the work, that's the journey I was on. The piece that I showed was actually the last, I went through a lot of different phases to get there. The first time I did this piece, I don't think it worked. I used women bodies for it. And I felt like it was a different conversation, and me trying to have this conversation through these female bodies didn't seem to work. And so it was a lot of me sort of playing around, like, how do I, as we know like this history of like male, like painters and like in the conversation to implicate myself. And it took me like a whole summer just beating my head against the wall, and was like, no, I need to like objectify, make myself the object in this, to have through which to have this conversation. Yeah. And so through that, like using sort of my body to talk about this body that's been this history of subjugation, but also this body that also subjugates large swaths of the Black community as well. So yeah, I mean, I'm still on that journey. That piece is just the latest iteration of that. I'm still trying to have this conversation, like with like this intraracial conversation, where we're having these this dialogue, using imagery, using paint, using installation to have this dialogue around like, what does it mean to be oppressed, and also someone who's an oppressor.
Yeah, no, it's really powerful. It kind of reminds me, do you know the work of Devan Shimonyama? Do you know his work? He's a Black queer artist, and I think he's at Carnegie Mellon right now, but I think there's very similar, I think his work reminds me of how you are, you know, sort of examining, you know, those issues of oppression, both, you know, outside of and within, you know, the community. I think that one of the things, for instance, you know, when we think about the amazing works of Carrie James Marshall, like in the barbershop and the beauty shop, right? How those are very, you know, kind of powerful community spaces, and his representation, that's really amazing. But in Chimanyana's work, for instance, he's speaking about how they are not for queer Black people, right? How they are, and so it's such a layered work, but it strikes me as also one that is so, that's so important for our lifetime. Yeah, so it's so powerful. And I think, that brings me, I see that we're close to time, but I want, so this is, and I see one of the questions here. And my next question is for all of you, and it kind of relates to Lauren's question. I think, I'm sorry, an anonymous question, but this work, how you're talking about this reminds me of Philip Guston. And so I think we're all kind of aware of what's going on now with Philip Guston. He's been in the news a lot. He's a painter whose retrospective has been canceled by prominent museums throughout many prominent museums, both in America and I think in Europe. And it's because that he was a painter who was an ex-painter who left sort of like his immersion as a career abstract expressionist and to respond to a moment in his lifetime that was, looking at civil rights and racism, and also the Red Scare and communism, right? And so he started making these works that were really using figural representations of the KKK, for instance. He created this one work called The Studio, in which a silent-headed figure paints a self-portrait, suggesting that racism is ingrained in all of us, and so it's really powerful, but it's really causing a big scandal right now, because I think many people feel that his work is right for the moment, and it should be shown, especially because of, he was a social activist for his whole life, right? And this is the reason why he made this huge change in his career, which was also a huge risk. And so I wanted to, lastly, kind of pose a question to all of you, and that is, in this moment that we're in, we have a lot of things that are affecting our lives. We have COVID. We have, the kind of the friction in our political life, maybe the death of our democracy, depending on how some people see it. And also, we're really facing this history that America really has to reckon with racial inequality, right? And so I'm just curious within all of that, and also just like, the struggles and the kind of going ons of us as human beings and as painters in our practice, how is this moment, what is affecting you in this moment? Is anything informing you? Like, is it how, maybe it's affecting how you're making work, maybe it's affecting how you're thinking about your life or your work? I know it's kind of a big question, but I just want to kind of put it out there. Does anyone would like to?
I have an answer, but I don't want to talk over anybody. If anybody has something I want to say.
No, yeah, go ahead.
So I feel like since pandemic hurt studio practice just as being quarantined, but since the Black Lives Matter, since the death of, or the murder of George Floyd, I haven't really felt very comfortable spending time focusing on like my feelings and what it was like to grow up in, a teenager, like my life. So most of my work has been design focused and still practicing, but kind of just working out and exercising and not really like sharing my own thoughts while I collect my own thoughts and try to read a lot and, hear other people's voices.
Yeah.
But as far as creating my own work, I've recently started to try to start a series that is not necessarily, obviously I don't feel like my views about white supremacy or the Black experience like in America are very much what anybody needs to hear right now. So I've tried to use my investigative skills to delve into some of the causes of where we are right now, such as the war on drugs, COINTELPRO, historical events that have reiterated and created the situation we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah. Great, thank you. That was a very thoughtful and I think multifaceted response. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. How about Carmen?
Um, so there's definitely a history of moments where moments of political like prominence, such as this, where artwork by black authors becomes very and validly so, like, important and at the forefront of the art world. And Antoine and I've had conversations too about the challenges that come along with being a Black person in a very politically activated moment, engaging in abstraction or some form of abstracting imagery that's not just the representation of bodies, because that kind of work is very necessary. And there's also like a history of sort of being pitted. There's this idea of being two extremes and us not being able to place ourselves or have control over, what kind of way in which the work manifests, the way it's presented and read. But in this moment though, I'm feeling also like that there's an importance in articulating or continuing conversations in a way that's even more thoughtful and clear about the nuances of the kind of work that like Antoine is doing, for example, I think super predator paintings and like people like Turquoise Dyson. And I don't know, I'm just like thinking about how I have optimism that ideology is shifting in this moment and that people are looking for expansion of understanding, and that involves like thinking about materials and processes differently too. And thinking about like if we have very complex experiences, that those also can manifest effectively in really diverse like presentations. So yeah, I mean, I think, but still there's also kind of like a hierarchical structure outside of just the authorship of being a Black artist and making work that isn't representational. There are a lot of other hierarchies at play too. But yeah, that's my
great. That's really, again, very, I think one of the things about your response too is you're giving so much context, within sort of like the histories, and sort of the context of how your work is viewed, so I think that's really important. Thanks, Carmen. Antoine?
Yeah, this year's been a mess. It's just been horrible. And it just, I don't know what I feel. So the first piece that I showed today, I made that, right? Like just, that was just there for me. And it was like, so it's like a moment of rest, but it was this, because I was just feeling this fatigue because with so there's COVID, right? But then there's these uprisings that happen. But then for me, in that moment, I was like, this is great, but this isn't new. And so it's like, oh, we're doing this again. And the protests, I'm glad that they took place. But then I was looking at it in the context of, man, this is a worldwide movement just to get the bare minimum of like holding like officers accountable. And like you had to do an entire movement around the world for that. And that still didn't happen. And so it's thinking that like this isn't sustainable. Like we can't do this because there will be, unfortunately, another Breonna Taylor and there will be another George Floyd. And like we can't do this every single time, or we shouldn't have to do this every single time. Right? Because we like, and unfortunately we do. And so it's just in that moment feeling honestly a sense of hopelessness. And
sorry, hey Antoine. I'm sorry.
Like that is sort of
Antoine, I'm sorry, just real quick, you cut out. Can you just can you do just back up a little bit?
Of course, yeah, I cut out.
Sure.
It was brilliant what I said too.
That's why I want you to say it again.
I don't know. No, I was just saying that
Yeah.
it's just not sustainable. Yeah, like all of this is just not sustainable to continue to do this with the bare minimum. But Black people, we have to, like, we've done this over and over again. And so that piece is just feeling this sense of hopelessness in that, like, I've seen this before, I'm seeing it now, and unfortunately I'm going to see it again. And I don't know what to do about it other than sort of make this work, that it's sort of a bomb, but like, I know that's sort of all it is. And granted, like, you can have like other meanings in other places. So there's that, but then there's also, you know, just in terms of like COVID and the effect it has on artists, just like we're working people, and the effect on how we make work and what we're making in the art as an institution. And so this summer and going into the fall, like really having to rethink, like, how do I engage audiences with my work? How do I engage institutions? Because now I have to really, because of the quarantine, I don't think the art world will be the same after the quarantine. We wouldn't be doing this, right, if it wasn't for the quarantine. This, you know, like, this is now a legitimate way of having like an art like conversation.
Yeah.
And so just thinking about ways as an artist and then as a Black artist, but just how do I navigate this in this new world based on COVID, based on these uprisings that you're having our institutions want to have these conversations now. So how do I now, as someone who makes work about this, engage in spaces as well?
Yeah, and Antoine, I just want to say that I totally hear you. You know, I think that this is, you know, many of us, you know, you and I know each other, you know, through social media too, and I think that, you know, I think we're constantly bombarded with just like more trauma, more trauma, right? And I think that I was just talking, you mentioned Hong An, you know, who teaches at UNC too. She and I were speaking about, you know, it's one of the reasons why it's also so hard right now is where we see these really important conversations starting to emerge, like such as these global protests, right? But then at the same time, we're seeing a greater polarization. And then also for, you know, some of us, like, let's say if we're artists, you know, I think that you and I are you know, we also have children about the same age, and there's that impact of like, you know, dealing with the time constraints from having our children at home too. But just, you know, watching basically fires all around us, right? And feeling like kind of not really sure how to move forward with it. I think, I don't know, but, you know, a couple of things that I really think about is I'm really mindful of how, you know, people out there in the streets protesting are taking the greatest risks. You know, they're really, I just so admire them. Like, they're really risking their bodily, you know, their lives basically, you know, for important movements such as this. And also how this is, of course, not old, right? I mean, sorry, not new. We've seen this throughout history. But I think you're bringing up, you know, within the context of also art making, art institutions, you know, this moment that is, it's interesting. It was happening even before COVID, like this kind of like pinnacle of like kind of the reckoning of sort of these art hierarchies, right? And then now with COVID, it's even, you know, with funding basically happening throughout all art institutions, like, you know, how does one move forward from these? So I think I so appreciate your response too. So I think that one of the things that I got a message from Maria. So she's wondering if we could go over about 10 or 15 minutes. Is that okay with the panelists?
Sure.
It seems like people are okay with that. So Maria, I think we'll just stop the discussion now. I just want to thank you all so much. This is, I feel like I am having a drink with you. There's a little bourbon in here, just letting you know. And I really look forward to the day where we can all be together and do this in person. And it can last for hours and hours, but I'll hand it over to Maria now.
Hi, everybody. So we did get a couple of questions. Antoine, let me just go right into a question from Lauren Etheridge. And she wants to know if you have ever explored or done any experimental or avant-garde performance art. I see a lot of fluid motion in your work and many of the themes you explore, such as monster theory and making the personal public feels like artistic action.
So I don't know if you can call it avant-garde, but that's yeah. But yeah, I've done performance. I've done some some video pieces where I dressed up sort of as one of the creatures, and it was snowing one day, and me and a friend, William Paul Thomas, sort of ran out with his camera, and we went into the woods, and I dressed up and started sort of grazing around, and people were looking at us really weird, but it was fun. And so him and I have been working on some short videos where I sort of go in various spaces and perform in a sense. And then also I'm doing I'm working on a new piece that's storytelling, but it's so it's like transmedia storytelling. So I'm doing a lot of different things. And one part of it is, just me sort of like doing dressing up again and doing performance. So yes, I have. I don't know, I'm just getting out there and playing around.
Great. We do have another question from through our YouTube comments, and this is for everybody from Kenneth Procius. And he wants to know, what can arts administrators, clients, or gallerists do that goes the extra mile for you as an artist? An example, sales, marketing, or helping grow your network. Anybody want to?
I'm kidding, but yeah, I mean, sales, like, probably what would help the most, right? We're all, I mean, I think that's something that we've touched on. Like, this is our job, even if we love it, even if we, have passion and have like a drive to create this work, it's still what we have chosen to as our career. And I think that, losing, I'll be honest, like, the pandemic has been horrible. We've talked about all of the traumas we've experienced, and I wouldn't say that, not being able to share the Front Burner show with my friends and community and family has been equal to any number of the other traumas that we've all experienced as a country or as a world. But it's still sad, and it's still disappointing. And I don't think that we necessarily need to rank our disappointments on a hierarchy. Like, we're allowed to feel bad for all of those things. So I'm sad that we weren't able to experience the show the way maybe we planned on, but also, like, this is 2020. Like, this is the way that the world works, and this isn't the worst thing that's ever happened to the planet, and this isn't the hardest thing that we as a species or as a people have had to deal with. And I know that I like to think about the idea that, we are descended from people that made it through all these terrible things, and we have that strength as individuals and as a community that we're going to make it through.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I just want to acknowledge Kenneth. He was one of my undergraduate students, and I think that for those of us who teach, I think that we all know about the kind of the rate of undergrads who stop making work, and Kenneth has excelled. He continues to make work. His work is evolving and wonderful, and he also, with his wife, I think they bought, was it 311 Gallery? Kenneth, I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting the name of, they basically bought a kind of a gallery, and they took over a gallery in Raleigh, which is wonderful. And they're also both artists, which is pretty also wonderful. And so, in response to that question, I think about everything that Antoine talked about in his response to the earlier question, which is, and I think as artists, one of the things that we are trying to do is have our practice survive, right? The ways in which our practice can continue and survive, and we're trying to figure that out. I think what people who maybe work within art administration, galleries and museums, maybe think about innovative ways that they could support maybe visibility, financial, but also visibility for artists. I think that, it's a lot for artists to do it all, right? And always has been, and it's kind of unrealistic also. So I think that that's really important. For instance, I know Anna Lee out of Art Space, she's been doing these one-on-one interviews, Zoom interviews with she's inviting people to speak with on Zoom. So that's an example of something like that.
Yes, I also want to reiterate that thought too, and this idea that we all are having to shift the way in which we engage with the work and each other. And so I know that a lot of people are probably feeling zoomed out right now, but like these kind of virtual engagements, you know, us having this conversation and the dialogue around the work is really valuable. And this is the way in which we could do it. I've seen like virtual residencies, and I've been able to participate as a visiting artist virtually and do studio visits with grads through this medium. So I think transitioning into using the tech as a way to support, again, with like their financial opportunities and ways to keep people engaged with the work. So keeping artists employed and also like active with their ideas and people like seeing the work and thinking about the work.
Great. Thank you, everybody. We do have one more question. This one's for Antoine, again, from Tina Marcus. And she's just very curious about your skins, the process, how thick they are, and how they are mounted. Can you talk a little bit about that, Antoine?
How they're mounted? Yeah. Oh, that was a lot of trouble. Yeah. So essentially, the way they're made is I take pigment and I take big buckets of matte gel medium. I mix certain colors, put them in the matte gel medium. I then pour them out on the floor and just pour it out. Give it 2 to 3 days to dry. Once they're dried, I can peel them up in sheets. And so you have these sheets of paint, and then you take them and sort of collage them together and to get something that looks interesting. And then you apply heat. So I take an iron, and then because they're plastic, because it's the binder is like this polymer because it's acrylic, and so it melts, it fuses together. And then on top of that, I add some of the gel medium distress textures on top. And so essentially that's what they are. And they're pretty thin at first, but I layer them. They're in various thicknesses depending on the type of, if I use, depends on the type of gel medium I'm using. I can paint on top of them, but I can also, Carmen helped me with this, where I was using chicken wire to sort of put impressions on them. And Carmen, I think, didn't you tell me to use Vaseline? I think it was you. And so like, because I was really messing that up. And so I can put indentations in the skin and build on top of it. And so the back of it, if I just hang it up, it starts to slowly fall off the wall because it's gel medium. And so on the back, I put nylon, and I put 2 or 3 layers of nylon. So that holds it in place. And then from there, I can put D-rings, which, like I said, was a lot of trial and error. There was a lot of leaving the studio with it on the wall and coming back with it just on the floor, and me saying, you know what, I'm gonna go be an accountant because I can't, this is hard. So, but I figured it out eventually. But yeah. I just want to thank Carmen for all the help in the process and like give like suggestions and stuff.
Well,
you guys are all friends, and I just met all you guys, but I'm really glad to have met all you.
Oh, no, right.
Yeah, of course, Luke. It was great to meet you too.
No, I know.
Well, I think this concludes our virtual panel discussion for our exhibition Front Burner. I want to thank the panelists, artists Antoine Williams, Carmen Neely, Lien Truong, and Luke Miller Buchanan for being part of this event. Thank you all so much for sharing this space with us today and you know, getting personal and talking about your work and your process. I do want to remind our attendees and also thank them for being here, but also want to remind them that the North Carolina Museum of Art is now open. You can note the museum's new hours and safety measures on the NCMA website, ncartmuseum.org. During your visit, please visit the exhibition Front Burner, Highlights in Contemporary North Carolina Painting to see Lien, Luke's, Carmen, and Antoine's work up close. You can purchase tickets for the exhibition on our website as well. And we deeply appreciate your support of this virtual program and your support by visiting the exhibition. And if you would like to continue to support the NC Museum of Art, we ask you to consider becoming a member of the museum or making a donation to the NCMA Arts Fund. If you're interested in becoming a member, would like to make a donation, you can visit our website for all that information as well. But I think that concludes it, this virtual event. If the panelists have anything to say, you can go ahead and have the floor.
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you, Maria, and thank you all of you for entertaining my questions.
I want to say thank you to Luke's cat.
To Luke's cat.
There's two of them. There's Billy and Zizi, and but they were kind of keeping to themselves a little bit. I thought they'd be jumping all over the place.
Awesome.
I saw your dog too, Carmen.
Yeah, there was a lot of barking. Fortunately, I was on mute when that happened, so I had to just like.
Yeah.
I think that's what's keeping a lot of us sane during all pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. Great.
Well, thank you all so much. Yeah, I'm going to stop the.
Oh, I have a question. I'm sorry, real quick.
Oh, sure. No,
So
go ahead.
I think someone asked a question if is the recording going to be available through YouTube?
Yes, yes, we are going to share the live stream. I also recorded it just in case, or our editor can clean it up, make it a little nicer. But the actual live stream is actually going to be on the website. So if you just click on that link, you can rewatch it.
Okay. Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
Bye.